What's up people, I'm Flynn and welcome to the Final Fantasy Upgrade Guides. Final Fantasy is the newest set on the Universes Beyond block, and with it came 4 awesome Commander Precon decks. Each of these come ready to play out of the box. They're stocked with dozens of unique new cards from the Final Fantasy games, plenty of cool reprints that all feature new artworks that set them within the Final Fantasy theme, and a ton of flavor. In this video, we're going to break down Counter Blitz, a deck that looks to hand out various counters to our creatures, and then move them around onto other creatures, possibly building up one to smash into our opponents. We're going to look over the best new cards exclusive to this deck, the most relevant reprints included, and finally, a small package of upgrades that you can use to begin fine-tuning this deck. Without any further ado, let's begin. I'd like to start out by meeting our 2 commander options, as understanding them is the best way to begin working with this deck. They guide the strategy of the deck and oftentimes present value engines that we can build off of as we tinker with our list. The first is Tidus, Yuna's Guardian, a 3/3 human warrior for 1 each of green, white, and blue. At the beginning of combat on our turn, we may remove a counter from a target creature we control onto a second target creature we control. Next, he has Cheer. Whenever 1 or more creatures we control with counters on them deal combat damage to a player, we may draw a card and proliferate. Do this only once each turn. Tidus is very powerful. Obviously, the most common counters we will see in Commander games are +1/+1 counters, which are everywhere in this deck, and so moving those around will allow us to build up maybe 1 creature with the group effort. There are many other kinds of counters, such as keyword ability counters, that grant abilities such as Indestructible, Flying, Double Strike, and so on, that may also be useful here. A great way to use his ability is to move our counters onto a single creature that has an ability to make it through to our opponent, which can then get us card draw and a proliferate trigger. Now, the way his Cheer ability works is that if you connect with all of your opponents with at least 1 creature, you will draw a card and get a proliferate trigger off of each. So in a 4-player game, we can get 3 triggers off at max, which will draw us 3 cards and give us 3 proliferates. But let's say those creatures have Double Strike. They deal combat damage during both the first strike phase of combat and then during the regular phase of combat, meaning that in theory, we could manage to get up to 6 triggers off of Tidus. This does still work within the restrictions of do this only once per turn that Tidus has as a balancer, but that being said, there is quite a bit of value here. To swap out with Tidus, our backup commander is none other than Yuna herself, the Grand Summoner. She will cost 1 additional generic mana more than Tidus, but for that she is a 1/5 human cleric with 2 abilities. Grand Summon allows her to tap to add 1 mana of any color, and whenever we next cast a creature spell this turn, that creature enters with 2 additional +1/+1 counters on it. In addition, whenever another permanent we control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, if it had 1 or more counters on it, you may put that many +1/+1 counters onto a target creature. It's unique to see a commander with a mana ability like this, as we don't frequently get good commanders that are also considered mana dorks, though she does very much support the theme of getting creatures out with counters. Getting 2 additional +1/+1 counters can really change the math that goes into calculating our board state, and it can make even the smallest of creatures larger. It can also, in theory, save us some mana during some circumstances. Yuna's second ability isn't quite a means to recycle counters, but a very interesting way to convert any counters that are on a creature that's dying into +1/+1 counters for another creature. Let's now dig into some of the newer cards from this deck. I really want to stress that for this section, I want to examine the cards as they will perform in this deck. These are the cards that I feel will contribute meaningfully to the strategy, and so as you look to upgrade your list, maybe consider keeping these cards around. Auron, Venerated Guardian, is a 4 mana 2/5 with Vigilance. Whenever Auron attacks, we put a +1/+1 counter on him. When we do, exile a target creature defending player controls with power less than Auron's power until Auron leaves the battlefield. This is thematic removal. When he first attacks, he will have 3 power, and as we continue to attack with him, he will grow larger and be able to remove larger creatures. Because this is aimed to remove the defending player's creatures, that means there will be 1 less creature around that can possibly block the incoming attack. I like that if we give him Indestructible or Shroud or any form of protection, he can stick around for a while and continue to remove problematic creatures from the game. This plays very nicely into the theme of counters in this deck, as we can move counters over onto him so that when he attacks, he will be even larger to hit bigger targets. Chocobo Knights is a 4-drop 3/3. Whenever we attack, creatures we control with counters on them gain double strike until end of turn. I love this card for how powerful an ability this can be. As we mentioned earlier, this could in fact double up the amount of value given to us by our commander, but even further, this gives us a huge edge in combat. Creatures with double strike deal their combat damage before creatures without first or double strike, and so this means that our creatures might be able to deal lethal damage to blockers before those blockers can even touch our creatures. Gata and Luzu is a 3-mana 1/1 with flash. When Gata and Luzu enters, choose target creature we control. If damage would be dealt to that creature this turn, prevent that damage and put that many +1/+1 counters on it. I love this card for what it can do. Say we are attacking with Auron and exile a creature with it, but an opponent blocks with a much larger creature that threatens lethal damage to Auron. We drop this into play, and not only does Auron not take any damage, but all that damage then gets converted into +1/+1 counters, making him far larger for the following turn. This reminds me of a more creature-based variation of Selfless Squire, which does a similar thing but protects us, the player, from damage. Owaka, Traveling Merchant, is a 2-drop 1/2 with an activated ability where we tap and remove a counter from a non-land permanent we control to draw a card. This has so many applications. In this deck, we'll likely be converting +1/+1 counters into card draw, but there are cards like the Sagas that can be used in conjunction with this, keeping them at 1 chapter turn after turn, so we can draw an extra card each time while also keeping our cards in play. Riku, Resourceful Guardian, is a 2/3 for 3. Whenever we put 1 or more counters onto a creature, until the end of turn, that creature can't be blocked by creatures our opponents control. We can also pay 1 mana and tap Riku to use her Steal ability, moving a counter from a target creature an opponent controls onto a target creature we control, but only at a sorcery speed. This card is nuts, so our commander wants our creatures with counters on them to connect with opponents, so we get card draw and proliferate triggers. Riku makes our creatures being given counters unblockable, making for a very good synergy. Sin, Unending Cataclysm, is a 7-mana 5/5 with flying and trample. As Sin enters, remove all counters from any number of artifacts, creatures, and enchantments. Sin enters with X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is twice the number of counters removed this way. When Sin dies, put its counters on target creature you control, then shuffle this card into its owner's library. Sin is the primary antagonist of Final Fantasy X, and so it's fitting to see this included in the deck along with Yuna and Titus. This behemoth being able to suck up all of the counters and get a huge number of +1/+1 counters on it means it will hit the battlefield and become immensely powerful. This can also target opponent's cards, and its death trigger allows it to pass on its counters to another creature, and then it shuffles away to return later. Summoner's Sending has perhaps my favorite artwork of any of the cards in this deck, and is a 2-mana enchantment. At the beginning of our end step, we may exile a target creature card from a graveyard. If we do, we create a 1/1 Flying Spirit creature token. It gets a +1/+1 counter on it if the exiled card's mana value was 4 or greater. This is Grave Hate, but in a very flavorful way that will give us a creature token with evasion. Blitzball Stadium costs X and 1 blue for an artifact. As it enters, support X, which puts a +1/+1 counter on each of up to X target creatures. It has Go for the Gold, where we can pay 3, tap the stadium, and until the end of the turn, the target creature gains, whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card for each kind of counter on it, and is unblockable this turn. Blitzball is a sport in Final Fantasy, and we have several cards in the deck that make reference to it, and the stadium itself having a card to represent it that also synergizes with the main strategy of the deck makes this an amazing design space. Speaking of design space, we have room in between all these great new cards to fit in some relevant reprint cards. Many of these are focusing on the +1/+1 counter strategy, as it is the primary strategy of the deck. All of them have received new alternate artworks for this release to put them into the setting of the Final Fantasy games. Let's check them out. Bane of Progress is a classic Wrath card, not only clearing the battlefield of artifacts and enchantments, but it comes in with a +1/+1 counter on it for each card it destroys. This is very relevant to bulking up a singular creature with counters, and it has the potential to wipe out any mana rocks or pesky enchantments along the way. Forgotten Ancient is a very underrated, overpowered card in +1/+1 counter decks, as it passively accrues value as players cast spells, building up a store of +1/+1 counters on itself. We can then move those counters around the battlefield during our upkeep, which synergizes with so many cards and could possibly dump them onto a creature that will present lethal. Generous Patron is a card that I've loved over the past year, largely because of my cross defense contractor deck. But this card allows us to draw a card whenever we put counters onto cards we do not control, such as the stun counters put on our opponent's creatures by Lulu, Stern Guardian. Luminous Broodmoth is very good in this deck. Our creatures will periodically die, and most of them don't have flying to begin with. The Broodmoth can revive them and put a flying counter on them. One of the instances in this deck where we can delve into ability counters, and a very relevant one. For as ubiquitous as flying is in Magic, a lot of decks don't run many means to block flyers, making this a very potent keyword to stand out. Scholar of New Horizons is a unique means to ramp in this deck. It comes into play with the +1/+1 counter, and we can tap it, remove a counter from a permanent we control, to tutor for a Plains card. Not a basic Plains, just a Plains card. Dual lands like Temple Garden and Hallowed Fountain are fair game. If an opponent controls more lands than us, we can then put that land onto the battlefield tapped, and if not, it just goes to our hand. It's a touch clunky, but it's mana ramp as performed by a white card. What did you expect? Walking Ballista is one of the win conditions of this deck. It enters the battlefield with +1/+1 counters on it equal to the mana value that we pay for each of the X costs. That value must be equal, so if we pay 3 mana for one X, the 3 must also be paid for the second. We can pay 4 mana to put a +1/+1 counter onto the Ballista, or we can remove a +1/+1 counter from the Ballista to ping any target for 1 damage. If we find a way to repeatedly replace the counter removed each time, we can, in theory, continuously ping the table until we win the game. This is a card that feels intended for Yuna, as her Grand Summon ability can actually help cast this creature for 1 mana, and then it comes into play with 2 +1/+1 counters because of her ability. That saves us 3 mana, since it would have normally costed us 4 mana to have the Ballista come out with the 2 counters. Of course, you can also use her ability to simply scale the counters, paying as you normally would, just to have the creature come out with 2 additional +1/+1 counters, just to make it bigger. Farewell is a classic board wipe that can be about as widespread as you choose, and it has some graveyard hate tacked on as well. I will say this, I've never played a Final Fantasy game through before, though I do intend to play Final Fantasy X at the recommendation of a friend, and I did do some spoiler-free research in preparation for these videos. The one thing that I have found is that I've been told this is one of those cards that depicts a very emotionally heavy scene, similar to the Farewell from the Doctor Who set. I'll have to revisit this after playing and see if it checks out. Final Fantasy fans, feel free to let me know in the comments. Same thing with Inspiring Call, which is great protection for our creatures in the event of a board wrath, though this also gives us some hefty card draw. Indestructible protects our creatures from being destroyed from lethal damage as well as destroy effects, though it cannot protect from debuffs or other means to reduce a creature's toughness to 0 or less. That being said, this is still a fantastic card that gives very efficient card draw. 3 mana to potentially draw multiple cards is a better return than we see even in blue. Now, at the time of recording, this is the first decks of these I've looked at, and so I'm unsure if this is a thing throughout the other decks, but I can appreciate that many of the artworks in this deck have either Yuna or Tidus in the artworks, which makes it feel like a much more cohesive, unified deck. I would like to hope that in future sets, Wizards explores the idea of having the main commanders be represented in some of the artworks of the cards of the deck, even if they're just reprinted with alternate artworks. Now, on the topic of building a cohesive deck, we want to upgrade this deck and start adding in cards to it that will help refine the strategy so that it flows better. Arwin, Mortal Queen, is a 2/2 elf noble for 3 mana, and she enters with an indestructible counter. For 1 mana, we can remove that indestructible counter from her, and another creature gains indestructible until the end of turn. We put a +1/+1 counter and a lifelink counter on both that target creature and on Arwin. This is perfect for this deck, since we're giving out +1/+1 counters and lifelink counters. Lifelink counters are a bit irrelevant when a creature has more than one of them on it, but having even one of these in circulation means that our commander has more counters to play with. I also think Arwin's Indestructible counter would be a great target for a Proliferate trigger, as we not only gain an additional use for her activated ability, but we can then start moving around the Indestructible counter onto other cards to help give them even more protection. Champion of Lampalt is a classic in aggressive green decks, getting bigger with each creature we have enter. The more important part of the ability is that creatures with power less than the champion's power can't block any creatures we control. This will make it much easier to get our damage through, and again, since the champion gets +1/+1 counters, we can proliferate those counters and bulk them up. Danny Pink is a 4/3 for 4 mana with Mentor, which is an attack trigger that puts a +1/+1 counter onto a target attacking creature with lesser power. Creatures you control have, whenever one or more counters are put onto this creature for the first time each turn, draw a card. Danny Pink also offers us some card draw off of our cards getting +1/+1 counters. I'm a huge fan of having foundational mechanics like card draw overlap with mechanics thematic to the deck they're in. And so us getting card draw off of doing the thing our deck already sets out to do just makes this a grand slam inclusion. Denry Klin, Editor-in-Chief, is a 2/2 for 4 mana that enters with our choice of a +1/+1, a first strike, or a vigilance counter on it. Whenever a non-token creature enters under our control, if Denry has counters on him, we put the same number and kind of counter onto that creature. This card is so good in this deck. We're doing a similar thing here as we are with Arwin, in possibly giving out a relevant keyword ability counter. First Strike and Vigilance are both great combat abilities, although with the Chocobo Knights being in the deck as well, offering Double Strike, I would usually recommend that you give the Vigilance counter out, as the Knights will grant Double Strike, which renders First Strike rather unnecessary. That being said, this gives a counter out to any creature that enters under our control, meaning that we have a turn that we can develop our board state and bring out several non-token creatures. We'll have a lot of counters to give around. This works especially well with Danny Pink, as every creature that enters will get counters on it from Denry, and then we will draw a card. Dreamtide Whale is a bulky 7/5 for 3 mana with Vanishing 2, meaning it enters with 2 time counters on it. At the beginning of our upkeep, we remove a time counter. When the final counter is removed from it, sacrifice it. More importantly, whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, we proliferate. This can also target those time counters, extending the whale's time in play. This is another way to add proliferate triggers, and is a huge creature to boot. Herald of the Secret Streams is a 2/3 for 4 mana with a single ability. Creatures we control with +1/+1 counters on them cannot be blocked. There's not much to say about this other than it gives our board unblockability. Considering our commander wants our creatures to connect, we should have no problem getting this out. Maybe count this as an additional win condition. Rosa Resolute White Mage is a 2/3 for 4 mana with Reach, which allows her to block flying creatures. At the beginning of combat on our turn, we put a +1/+1 counter onto a target creature we control, and it gains lifelink until the end of turn. This one is also from the Final Fantasy set, and while she doesn't give out any other counters besides the +1/+1 counter, it also allowing us to have lifelink is still relevant. We get a counter onto one of our creatures, and that can trigger a whole smattering of other abilities, and possibly even making a creature unblockable. Strixhaven Stadium is a 3 mana artifact that can tap to add a colorless mana, and then we put a point counter onto the Strixhaven Stadium. Whenever a creature deals combat damage to us, we remove a point counter from the stadium. Whenever a creature we control deals combat damage to a player, we put a point counter on the stadium. If it then has 10 or more point counters on it, we remove all point counters, and then that player loses the game. This card is so much fun, and it adds a really unique minigame mechanic to the deck. We can proliferate those counters using Titus, and then if we hit an opponent and reach 10 points, that player will lose the game. Now, there was one ruling that I had to look up so that way you don't have to. If you hit each opponent as it reaches 10 counters, because each creature connecting will trigger this separately, the one that makes it reach 10 will be the one that removes all of them to have that current defending player lose the game, and then you proceed with the further attacks. You would have to have the ability to add another 10 point counters on it after removing them to have another player lose the game. That being said, this is one of my favorite cards to add into my decks, so I highly recommend giving it a shot. Get it? The Oelith is perhaps the single most expensive addition this deck could look to include. 1 mana will get you a legendary artifact. Whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, if it had any counters on it, put those counters on the Oelith. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if the Oelith has any counters on them, you may move all counters from the Oelith onto target creature. Our deck likes to bulk up a single creature capable of presenting lethal, and this is a great way to not lose those counters should our creature be removed from the battlefield. Now also in this deck we have a card called Resourceful Defense that does a notably similar thing. However, because of the way the Oelith works, there are some unique rulings that actually occur. The Oelith's wording might be slightly confusing because it implies that you simply take the counters off of the creature leaving the battlefield and stow them on the Oelith. This is technically misleading, as you are in essence putting the same kind and quantity of counters onto the Oelith. Basically, you're copying them. This means that cards like Resourceful Defense will allow us to move the counters onto another permanent, while the Oelith gets its own versions of those counters, and this can lead to some crazy scaling shenanigans. Finally, Tribute to the World Tree is a 3-mana enchantment. Whenever a creature enters under our control, we draw a card if its power is 3 or greater. If it isn't, we put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. This plays so nicely into what we're doing here. We have card draw for the times where we get a larger creature coming down, and for the times when we don't, creature will get 2 +1/+1 counters on it, which plays perfectly into our deck strategy. In the base list, we have 12 creatures of the 35 creatures in the deck that have power 3 or greater, meaning that there's a solid number that will just draw us cards upon entering, and the rest giving us +1/+1 counters is simply feeding into the deck's engine. Now, to make room for these cards, we do have to cut some cards to maintain the 100 card deck limit. I feel like one of the best ways to test which cards are ideal to cut is to play a couple of games with the deck. Look for the cards that underperform, ones that either cost too much to reasonably cast without holding it up for multiple turns, or cards that don't feel like they contribute much to the overall strategy. Maybe you're not a fan of one of the 2 commander options and you want to remove one of them to make room. Maybe you want to cut some of the cards that have a higher mana value so your deck runs more low to the ground and can allow for multiple spells to be cast per turn. At the end of the day, how you look to upgrade your deck is up to you. You are responsible for the cards that go into the deck, and you are also responsible for the experience that comes from playing it. I think the Counter Blitz deck is a fun deck. It's a +1/+1 counter deck, and we have hundreds of cards that support that strategy from multiple sets throughout Magic's history. I've seen some people building this list into an Invect deck because of the proliferate triggers and the +1/+1 counter strategy, nicely supplementing the relatively small nature of creatures with Infect. That's up to you, though I would be interested in to hear what your plan is to take this deck to the next level. Do you have some spicy tech or a unique take on this deck? Feel free to let us know in the comments section. I plan to keep this guide available so that folks can come back to it whenever, and hopefully you can add your input to the conversation so others working on their list might get inspired. If you enjoyed this video or liked this deck, leave a like on this video. If you're new to the channel, subscribe so that you never miss an upload. And as always, I'm Flynn. Be good, people.